The feasts were given officially on Mount Sinai in Leviticus chapter 23. In verse 4, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. I want you to notice something here as we look through each one of these feasts that God went through. Verse 5, he's very specific when he says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And he goes on to unleavened bread. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation where you shall not do any ordinary work. In other words, the day after Passover was to be a Sabbath. But he's very specific here, is he not? First fruits, he talks about waving the sheaf before the Lord at a certain time. Pentecost is supposed to happen 50 days after that last Sabbath. So he's very specific here about these times and dates. And you're going to see in the course of the study why he was so specific. Then, of course, we have trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles, which we're going to look at in a future study. But let me ask you a question. When was the first Passover? I think many of us know the answer to that question. It was here when the Israelites were being taken out of Egypt after the plagues had had their impact there on Pharaoh, and God gave them instructions to put blood on their doorposts, very specific there, top, sides, put the blood there, and when he sees the blood, he will, quote, pass over their home. Otherwise, the firstborn of every family was going to be killed. He says there in Exodus 12, the Lord said to Moses in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Well, what month was that? That was the month of Nisan, which would have been our April. But God tells the Israelites before pulling them out of Egypt that this will be, from this point on, this will be your first month. And verses 3 through 6 tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, so 4 days before Passover will become the 14th, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. So God's telling Israel here, I want you to take a Passover lamb into your home 4 days before it's sacrificed. That kind of makes you wonder why. We don't know all the reasons why, but it is fun to speculate that maybe God is wanting the family to know the lamb. Maybe God is wanting the family to get comfortable with the lamb. Maybe the kids start treating it like a pet, like something special, knowing that it was going to have to be sacrificed. And then, of course, on the 14th, this day, the 14th, shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast, as a moed, to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. So for 1,500 years, Jews would slaughter a lamb on Nisan 14, because 15 years later, the Lamb of God would be crucified on Nisan 14. Do you understand that the Passover was a rehearsal? God was having his people rehearse the sacrifice of Christ for 1,500 years before it actually came to pass. When we look at unleavened bread, he says in verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day, the 15th, you shall remove leaven out of all of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So there's this concept of 7 days of removing the leaven from your household. Of course, we know that leaven is kind of a description in the Old Testament of sin. And we're going to learn something very powerful about unleavened bread too as we continue to go on. Verse 17, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. So what's important here? Well, all of this was commanded before God officially introduced the feast. Remember we said earlier in another slide that they were officially given at Mount Sinai. And yet we have God teaching the Israelites the Passover and the unleavened bread feasts before they even leave Egypt. So he's already instituting this in their hearts and their minds before it is officially given at Mount Sinai. What is the Passover? Well, the Passover is basically the Spirit of God passing over those that have the blood of the Lamb on their doorposts. And again, I mentioned earlier, you begin to see the parallels all over the place as we study through this lesson on the feasts. But just to get a recap before we go on, I want you to understand that there's a few things that were supposed to happen here. 4 days prior to the Passover, they were supposed to find a pure lamb. They were supposed to keep it in their house for 4 days. One of the things that they did in that 4-day period, aside from getting attached to it, was they were to inspect it because it needed to be a pure lamb that was sacrificed on that day. And then, of course, they were to remove the leaven. But just for fun, looking at that doorpost on the left, they were instructed very specifically where to put that blood. And it's interesting that it forms a cross, is it not? The blood that was put up on the top doorpost would have dripped down to the ground below. From side to side, it forms a cross. Let's look at unleavened bread a little closer. Again, this would have been Nisan 15, the day after Passover, that this feast began. In verse 7 of chapter 13, God said, unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all of your territory. So he didn't just want it out of the house. He didn't want it anywhere. And it's interesting to note that the word unleavened bread in Hebrew is the word matzah. Have you ever had matzah bread? We've all had matzah bread. But you'll notice that matzah bread is striped. You'll notice that it's also pierced. Do you see the parallels? They're all over the place, aren't they? What would they do? Well, when this time came around, they would turn it into a game for the kids. This is actually a very well-known practice amongst rabbinical Jews. But they would use a candle for light because they didn't have electricity. They would use a feather as a broom, and they would use a spoon as a dustpan. And when they found leaven, they would put it into a linen cloth. Now, to make it fun for the kids, Mom used to hide leaven in the house for the kids to go find. And Dad, of course, would go with them. And when they found leaven, they would put it in this linen cloth and then go out and have what was called a communal burn. So everyone who found the linen in their home would take it, the leaven in their home would take it out in the linen parallel and have a communal burn. 1 Corinthians 5 says, your glorying is not good. You know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us what? Keep the feast. Not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Again, pay attention to the parallels. What was to happen next? Well, the waving of the sheaf. This was the barley harvest. And God was telling them in chapter 23 of Leviticus, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits, keyword, of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord. So in their harvest of barley, they were supposed to gather the first fruits of it, the first sheaf, and wave it before the Lord. Something very small, I know, but keep that in mind because it's going to come into play in future slides. So let us understand the times. Again, in the spirit of recapping, I want to make sure you understand this. 4 days before the Passover, they needed to gather together a pure lamb, inspect it to make sure it was pure, bring it in the house for 4 days, and remove the leaven from the house. Then the Passover happens on the 14th. Unleavened bread begins the day after, which is also a Sabbath. And then the waving of the sheaf with first fruits, and then a counting of 50 days to Pentecost. So I want you to keep that picture in your mind going forward as we look at Jesus, which we are going to do right now.